Hello and welcome to How to See Spiritually with me, Mark Vernon, a series looking at intuition and the eye of the soul. If you like the talk, please do share it and feel free to leave comments. In this episode, I'd like to talk about ego. Now, I think ego is one of the most misunderstood elements in any spiritual teaching, any spiritual path or development. Broadly speaking, the idea that goes around is that ego must go, and that egolessness is the kind of goal, smashing the ego, knowing that you're a no self, for those who've read a bit of Buddhism. And I think this is profoundly misunderstood. There's something more subtle being said about the ego here. To cut to the chase, the idea is not that we shouldn't have an ego, that we shouldn't have a sense of self. The question is what that ego or sense of self is in the service of. And if it's in the service of more than itself, more than the ego, more than the self, then it becomes like a lens in a camera that can focus the soul and transmit life to us, make it our own, but also sharing life with everybody else and with the world around us. The problem is when the ego becomes a kind of end in itself, when it's in its own service and tries to capture, hold on to, possess that which really belongs to the spirit of the world at large, and which our I-ness, our ego, can enable us to tap into in the particular way that humans can. So ego in itself is not bad. In fact, it's necessary, I think, for the spiritual life, for this sense of seeing spiritually, for spiritual perception. But the question is, what's it in the service of? Is it in the service of itself? Then it's going to cut you off from the spiritual elements. If it's in the service of seeing the spiritual elements, knows that it's part of this greater flux, then it will serve you very well. Now, in a way, we know this because when we see great spiritual individuals, they're definitely individual people. They're very much themselves. They have an I-ness, what ego means, a sense of being an I, an individual, a particular person, very much. And yet at the same time, they transmit and channel something more than themselves. One of the most famous spiritual figures on the planet, the Dalai Lama, shows this completely. You see a picture of him, he's definitely an individual, definitely a sense of a particular person, particular time, particular place, transmitting something that could only be coming from him. And yet at the same time, he's transmitting more than is just him. He's somehow open to life in all its fullness, not just serving himself in his personality. He's become a kind of a doorway, a portal to much more than just himself. Through the cultivation of himself, I think, through all that Buddhist practice, he's learnt how the ego can be in the service of something more rather than caught up unto itself. And you see it the minute you see a picture of the Dalai Lama. There'll be others you know of, perhaps people that aren't famous, but that somehow have a real sense of presence, a particularity to them, and yet also seem to capture much more than their particularity. So that's why ego matters. Now, it matters another way too, because as well as being this focus or lens that can transmit the spiritual dimension and through which we can see the spiritual dimension of life, it also is the place where we do a lot of the work that enables us to see more spiritually. And it's particularly around this sense of shifting our sense of life from the orbit of ourselves to ego-centeredness, from that to seeing that the centre is sort of everywhere, actually, not just inside our own selves, but that the life is far more expansive than that. In psychotherapy, this is known as the work of narcissism. Narcissism actually is not necessarily a bad thing, a bit like ego is not necessarily a bad thing. There's a kind of self-love that means that you're comfortable in your own skin. That means you can get over yourself. And it's only then that you can really see more than yourself, that you can see there are others, you can see that there's a life around you, because you cease to be preoccupied with your own life, with your own sense of self, through being comfortable enough with that. As the great Platonist and philosopher Iris Murdoch put it, love is the painful realization that something else exists. That painful realization is the work of getting over your own sense of doubt and struggle, your narcissistic egoic concerns, and realizing that you're good enough. Actually, there's a kind of love of self which enables you to move beyond that, and that is another way of thinking about the way that ego serves something beyond itself and not just becomes preoccupied with itself. It's easier said than done often. I think we're born into a state as very young individuals where we have to make ourselves the centre of all things, and that's what a baby must do. It must scream and shout in order to survive, to communicate its very basic needs. And parents who look after a young child will know that they orientate themselves around the ego of this new creature that's come into their life. Freud, who noticed this, Sigmund Freud, he talked about his majesty, her majesty, the baby. That's what it is to be a young person, just to get into life to start with. But what we have to learn if we're going to thrive in life is not to be caught up in that early state, but to get over ourselves, to feel we trust life enough. We don't have to be constantly demanding, and then life can open up for us. We can realise that we have a mother, we have a father, we have parents, maybe siblings. Life, as it were, opens up in ripples as we get over ourselves and as our ego turns outward rather than being probably inevitably turned inward as it is as a young child. So there's a kind of developmental element to this, as well as it being one of the key places of work for any spiritual path. It's something that's captured in many wisdom traditions. Take Christianity. I think St. Paul's discovery was very much that he was free in order to learn the truth about himself, which wasn't his own concerns, but was actually the concerns that he felt had been opened up to him by his encounter with Jesus, in the story. He was originally very sort of defensive, very concerned with a certain kind of Judaism, and then at his conversion, when he's confronted with Jesus, his mind opens onto what was originally actually another sort of Judaism captured in the life of Jesus, and then eventually became Christianity. That movement from self-concern to some broader concern, so much so that you're even prepared to lay down your life in the service of it. That's what this ego issue is really about. Laying down your life may be a literal requirement in some parts of the world at some times, but it's always a symbolic requirement that the life that the ego originally perhaps does want for itself must be laid down, must be given up in order that it can open up to a wider source of life. And that's always a bit of a struggle. It's always about trust. It's always about fear, uncertainty. It's always about not being so preoccupied and self-concerned. So very often in spiritual traditions you hear talk about dying to yourself, about losing your life in order to find it. That in these days is how we would talk about the ego and this movement to enable it to see spiritually, to open the eye of the soul. It's become particularly problematic in the modern world, I think, because we are not sure anymore that there is a life beyond our own sense of self, our own I-ness, our own conscious personality knocking around inside our skulls, unsure of itself, doubting that it exists elsewhere, even in others. Maybe it's a delusion itself, just a rush of serotonin and dopamine. These are often the ways that people talk about their I-ness, and no wonder, therefore, they have problems with their ego. Their egos do become rather commanding, commandeering, that narcissistic issues are often seen in mental health hospitals and in psychotherapy. If there isn't a world that the ego can turn onto, if that's the conviction, then how can the ego ever turn beyond itself? This encapsulated self, as it's sometimes put, of the Enlightenment, that's just self-interest, that runs life for its own benefit. If you don't believe there is a spiritual life, if you can't even get an intimation, a perception of it at all, then that is more or less bound to amplify. But there is this other tradition, this sense that seeing spiritually is about nurturing the ego for sure, making it feel secure enough in order to relax, making it trust life enough in order to see that it can turn onto wider life. And then the ego becomes in the service of spiritual perception. It becomes very much part of the soul awakening. It's that place where the individual person, in all their splendid particularity, channels the richness of life through them so that their particularity becomes part of the universal. so that their individual soul, their own I-ness, can open ultimately onto the I-ness of God in monotheism. The God that said, I am. Only a person with a powerful sense of their own I am can really appreciate that. It's got to be able to mirror that in itself. So in the Buddhist inflection too, I think there's something similar going on. It's not that you rush straight to no self, kind of obliterating yourself. What you realise is that your sense of self is in the service of a deeper flow of life. Some traditions of Buddhism it's called the deathless. It's called divine compassion. That's what no self means. It means that the self of itself isn't a contained sort of whole universe, whole cosmos unto itself, but is a vehicle, a channel through which the individual can open onto the wider pulse of life, consciousness that many Buddhist traditions at least believe is the ground of all reality. So don't think that the ego is against you in the spiritual path. It actually is one of the key points that can open onto seeing more spiritually.